Chapter 1. The Arrival. The wind howled through the towering trees that bordered the old house, their gnarled branches swaying ominously. Heavy clouds hung low in the sky, blocking out the last traces of sunlight. Isabelle Harding stepped out of her car, squinting up at the large, weathered mansion before her. The house loomed, its dark, crumbling facade a stark contrast against the pale, overcast sky. It had stood abandoned for years, though rumors of its mysterious past had never truly faded. Isabelle set her suitcase down on the uneven stone path that led to the entrance. Her breath formed small clouds in the crisp, evening air as she paused to take in the sight. The structure was grand, but there was something unsettling about the way it seemed to lean slightly, as if the earth beneath it were trying to swallow it whole. Vines clung to the walls, creeping up like skeletal fingers, their leaves dried and brittle from the cold. The front door, heavy with age and painted a dull shade of green, creaked open at the touch of her hand. Dust stirred in the air as she stepped inside, her shoes echoing on the wooden floor. The grand foyer was expansive, with high ceilings and a sweeping staircase that curled up to the second floor. Faded wallpaper clung to the walls, and patches of discoloration hinted at the years of neglect. A cold draft slipped through the gaps in the windows, swirling around her ankles. She shivered and glanced toward the large windows at the far end of the hall, where the outside world was bathed in an eerie twilight. The trees swayed violently in the wind, casting twisted shadows that danced across the floor. The house groaned in response, a deep, low creak that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Isabelle walked further into the house, her footsteps the only sound breaking the unsettling silence. She passed a long row of portraits lining the wall, paintings of stern, faceless figures, their eyes hidden behind layers of grime. The frames were gilded, their once bright gold now tarnished with age. The house felt as though it was watching her, waiting for her next move. She turned toward the kitchen, where remnants of the past lay forgotten. Dust-covered dishes were stacked neatly in open cabinets, and an old stove sat unused, its surface blackened from years of soot. A single chair rested near the table, tipped on its side as though it had been knocked over in haste. The wind outside grew louder, rattling the windows, and Isabelle's gaze shifted toward the staircase. The second floor beckoned to her with an unsettling pull. She hesitated, her eyes lingering on the dark landing above, but something about the silence below pressed her forward. The steps creaked beneath her weight as she ascended, her fingers trailing along the wooden railing, worn smooth from years of use. When she reached the top, the hallway stretched before her, a long corridor that seemed endless. Closed doors lined both sides, their paint chipped and peeling. The air was colder here, heavier somehow. Her breath came in shallow, nervous puffs as she moved forward. The last door at the end of the hallway stood slightly ajar, as though someone had only just left it that way. Isabelle's heart quickened as she approached, her mind racing with images of the house's history, stories of strange noises and things that went missing, of rooms that locked themselves and windows that shattered without cause. Pushing the door open, she stepped into what must have once been a bedroom. The large four-poster bed was draped with tattered sheets, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. The curtains hung limp, half pulled across the window as if someone had been in a rush to close them. In the corner of the room sat an old, dusty mirror, its surface smeared and clouded with time. Isabelle took a step closer to the bed, and as she did, the air seemed to shift. A faint noise reached her ears, a distant, almost imperceptible whisper. She froze, listening. The whisper came again, this time closer, as though it was coming from the very walls around her. Her eyes darted toward the mirror, its shadowy surface reflecting nothing but the dim light from the window. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the cold, cracked glass. Just before her fingers met its surface, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Then, from somewhere deep within the walls, there came a sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. Isabelle turned sharply, her heart pounding as the sound grew louder, moving through the floorboards beneath her. She backed away from the mirror, her eyes wide, but the room remained still, empty. The footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the silence once again. She hurried out of the room, closing the door behind her with a soft thud. Her pulse still raced as she moved down the hall, her steps quickened by an unease she couldn't shake. The house had been abandoned for years, but it didn't feel empty. Someone, was here, watching her, waiting. As Isabelle descended the staircase, the wind outside howled louder, pushing against the walls with a ferocity that made the house creak and groan. She reached the front door and paused, her hand hovering over the handle, as if she might leave. But instead, she turned back toward the darkened hallway, her decision made. Whatever secrets this house held, she was determined to uncover them. She wasn't going to run. With a deep breath, Isabelle moved deeper into the shadows of the house. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Walls. The first night in the house was cold and unnerving. Isabelle slept lightly, the unfamiliar groans of the building slipping into her dreams and blurring the lines between wakefulness and sleep. The wind outside continued its relentless assault on the windows, rattling them in their frames. She lay on the thin mattress of the bed she had hastily prepared, staring at the ceiling, her mind drifting in and out of old memories and the present. The room was nearly pitch black, save for the occasional flicker of moonlight that broke through the clouds and slipped through the curtains. The quiet between gusts of wind was almost unbearable, leaving an eerie stillness that seemed to fill the house with an ominous weight. The house felt alive in a way that was unsettling, as if it had its own pulse, its own breath. Hours passed like this, a haze of restlessness, until at last sleep found her. But it was short-lived. A sound, a faint, nearly imperceptible whisper, brought her awake in the early hours before dawn. Isabelle lay still, her body frozen under the thin blanket. Her eyes adjusted to the dark, scanning the room, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she wondered if the noise had been part of a dream, but as the silence stretched, the sound came again, soft, like the rustling of fabric, or the quiet murmur of someone speaking just out of earshot. She sat up slowly, her breath shallow. The room remained unchanged, its dark corners unmoving, the air still cold and sharp. But the sound persisted, coming from the walls themselves, as if the house were whispering to her. The noise was faint, almost too soft to make out, but it carried a weight that sent a chill down her spine. Isabelle rose from the bed, careful not to disturb the uneasy quiet around her. She moved toward the wall where the sound seemed to originate, her bare feet making no noise on the wooden floor. The wall was cold to the touch, and as she pressed her ear against it, she could hear the sound more clearly now. It was a whisper, rhythmic and steady, like the ebb and flow of a distant conversation that she couldn't quite make out. Her mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the wind finding its way through the old walls, or maybe the house had pests, small creatures scurrying between the beams. But even as she tried to convince herself of these possibilities, the sound deepened, becoming something more deliberate. There was a pattern to it, a subtle but constant repetition, as if someone, or something, was trying to speak. She stepped back from the wall, her heartbeat quickening, and looked around the room again. Everything remained in its place, untouched. But the air felt different now, heavier, filled with an invisible tension that prickled at her skin. Isabelle left the bedroom, moving into the hallway with slow, deliberate steps. The house was dark and still, the only light coming from the faint glow of dawn beginning to creep through the windows. She stood at the top of the staircase, her eyes scanning the shadowy corridor. The house was quiet now, as though it had been waiting for her to wake. She descended the stairs, her hand trailing lightly on the banister, and paused at the bottom. The air here felt colder, as if the draft from outside had found its way inside. The kitchen was silent, the old appliances and furniture casting long shadows in the dim morning light. Isabelle moved toward the foyer, but something made her stop in her tracks. A faint noise reached her ears again, a low, almost inaudible murmur, like the whisper she had heard upstairs, but closer now. She turned toward the living room, her pulse quickening, and stepped forward cautiously. The door to the room stood partially open, revealing only a sliver of the dim interior. As she approached the doorway, the whispering grew louder, and now it was unmistakable. It came from within the room, soft and insistent, like the wind passing through leaves. Isabelle pushed the door open wider, her breath caught in her throat. The living room was just as she had left it the night before, dusty and used and draped in shadows. The large fireplace dominated one wall, its blackened hearth cold and empty. Old, mismatched furniture filled the room, their worn fabrics and chipped wood telling of years of neglect. But there was something else, something she hadn't noticed before. The mirror. It sat on the far wall, above an old cabinet, its tarnished surface casting a dull reflection of the room. Isabelle hadn't paid much attention to it the night before, but now it seemed to draw her in. The whispering was louder here, more distinct, though still too soft to make out any actual words. She moved closer to the mirror, her footsteps slow and careful. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the room, and as she stood before it, she could see her own reflection, pale and shadowed in the dim light. But there was something wrong with the glass. The surface was cloudy, smeared in places, as though something had been pressed against it. Isabelle's hand moved toward the mirror, her fingertips brushing against the cold surface. The moment her skin touched the glass, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, an emptiness that seemed to fill the room and press in on her. She pulled her hand back quickly, her breath coming in short gasps. She stepped away from the mirror, her heart racing. The house was quiet again, but the unease remained. Something was wrong. Something was here. The whispers, the strange coldness, the oppressive silence. They were all tied to this place, to whatever secrets it held. She retreated to the foyer, her mind racing. The day was just beginning, and sunlight now streamed through the windows, casting long beams across the floor. But even in the light, the house felt dark, as though the shadows themselves were alive, lurking just beyond her sight. Isabelle knew she should leave. Everything in her told her to get out while she still could. But there was something about the house that called to her, something she couldn't explain. She couldn't leave, not yet, not until she understood what was happening. She stood there for a long moment, staring back at the darkened hallway behind her, the weight of the house pressing in around her. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked deeper into the shadows once more, the whispers still echoing faintly in the back of her mind. Chapter 3. The Locked Room. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next as Isabelle became more familiar with the house's peculiarities. The unsettling whispers still came and went, always faint, always just out of reach. She tried to ignore them, to focus on her reason for being here. But the house seemed to have its own plans, drawing her deeper into its shadows with each passing hour. One morning, as the rain tapped lightly against the windows and a gray fog wrapped itself around the house, Isabelle found herself wandering through the upstairs hallway once again. The doors, all closed, stood like silent sentinels, each one leading to a forgotten room, a forgotten story. She had explored most of them in the days since her arrival, each room holding some relic of the past. Old furniture, dust-covered paintings, and remnants of lives long gone. But there was one door she hadn't opened yet, one door that seemed to call to her every time she passed it. The door at the very end of the hallway. It was locked. She had tried it before, jiggling the old brass handle and pushing against the solid wood, but it had refused to budge. The key, if there was one, had long been lost. The door was plain, unlike the others, with no decoration or sign of what lay behind it. But there was something about it, something that made Isabelle's heart quicken every time she passed by. It was as if the very air around the door was different, heavier, colder. Today, she stood in front of it again, her hand resting on the cool metal of the doorknob. The rain outside was steady, a soft, rhythmic drumming that seemed to echo through the house. The whispers had been quiet for most of the morning, leaving the house in an eerie silence. Isabelle pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear something, anything, on the other side. Nothing, but she knew there was something behind this door. She could feel it. Determined, she turned away and descended the stairs to the first floor, her footsteps quick and deliberate. The The house had been filled with odd trinkets and forgotten objects, and she was sure that somewhere, hidden in the depths of the clutter, there had to be a key. She spent hours rummaging through drawers, searching old cabinets, and lifting the heavy cushions of forgotten armchairs. The house groaned around her as if watching her every move, the creaks and groans of its old bones following her through every room. Finally, in a small, dusty chest tucked away in a corner of the living room, she found it. The key was old, its metal tarnished and slightly bent, but it had the look of something that had once been important. Isabelle held it up to the faint light coming through the window, her pulse quickening. There was no doubt in her mind. This was the key to the locked room. Without hesitation, she hurried back upstairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway seemed longer now, the shadows deeper, as she approached the locked door once more. The air was cold around her, the faint smell of damp wood filling her nose as she stopped in front of the door. With trembling hands, she fit the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Isabelle took a deep breath and turned the key. The lock clicked. The door creaked as it swung open slowly, revealing the room beyond. At first glance, it appeared to be just like the other rooms in the house, dusty and used, frozen in time. But as Isabelle stepped inside, she knew immediately that this room was different. The air was thicker here, musty and stale, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The curtains were drawn tightly over the windows, blocking out all but the faintest traces of light. The room was small, barely furnished, a bed, a dresser, and an old rocking chair in the corner. But there was something else, something that made Isabelle's skin prickle with unease. The walls. At first, she couldn't understand what she was seeing. The wallpaper, once a pale shade of blue, was covered in dark, erratic lines. As she stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest, she realized what they were: scratches. Deep, jagged marks clawed into the walls, some long and sweeping, others short and frantic. They crisscrossed the room, covering nearly every inch of the surface. Isabelle's breath caught in her throat as she ran her fingers lightly over the scratches. The gouges were deep, deeper than any fingernail could have made. Whoever, or whatever, had made these marks had done so with desperate force. The room felt wrong. The air was oppressive, pressing down on her like a weight. Isabelle backed away from the walls, her eyes scanning the small space, looking for anything else out of place. Her gaze fell on the bed. It was perfectly made, the blankets and pillows arranged with meticulous care, untouched by the years of dust that coated everything else in the house. But there, on the pillow, was something strange. A small, black object, barely visible against the white fabric. She approached the bed cautiously, her footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. The object was a small box, its surface smooth and polished, unlike anything else in the room. She picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over in her hands. It was light, almost weightless, and there were no visible seams or hinges. Isabelle's curiosity gnawed at her. She tried to open it, her fingers searching for a latch or a hidden compartment, but the box remained sealed, as if it were meant to stay that way. Frustrated, she set it back down on the bed, her mind racing with questions. What was this room? Who had stayed here? And why had it been locked away? The scratches on the walls seemed to pulse in the dim light, drawing her gaze back to them. There was something primal about them, something that made her skin crawl. She couldn't stay in the room any longer. The air was too thick, the silence too heavy. Isabelle hurried out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. She locked it again, her hands shaking as she twisted the key. The hallway felt colder now, the shadows deeper than before. The house groaned softly, as if it was satisfied with her discovery. She didn't feel any sense of relief as she descended the stairs, the key still clutched tightly in her hand. She returned to the living room, dropping the key onto the small table beside the couch. The rain had stopped, leaving the house in a suffocating silence once again. But now, every sound, every creak, every groan, felt louder, more deliberate. Isabelle sat down, her eyes unfocused, her mind spinning with thoughts of the locked room, the scratches, the strange box, the stifling air. Everything about it was wrong. She knew she should leave the house, abandon whatever secrets it held, but she couldn't. Not yet. The house had drawn her in, its whispers and shadows wrapping around her like a web. And now, there was no turning back. She was part of it now. The locked room was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Stairs. The rain returned that night, falling harder than before, filling the air with a constant patter that echoed through the house. Isabelle sat at the small kitchen table, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. The locked room weighed heavily on her mind, the memory of the deep scratches and the strange box refusing to leave her thoughts. She had locked the door again, but the feeling of something lurking behind it stayed with her. The house had grown colder, or at least it felt that way. The walls seemed to exhale a chill that settled deep into Isabelle's bones. She tried to focus on the task at hand, sorting through old papers and documents she had found in one of the drawers, but her mind kept wandering back to the door at the end of the hall, the one that had been locked for so long. She knew she shouldn't go back. She had no reason to. Not yet. But something pulled at her, an invisible thread drawing her deeper into the house's mystery. The whispers had returned, faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, but now they seemed to move through the walls, circling her like a distant hum. It was as if the house was speaking to her, telling her things in its own secret language. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl and the rain lash against the windows. The sound of the house shifting in the storm was constant, a creak here, a groan there. It was alive in the way old houses often seemed to be, but tonight, the sounds felt deliberate, like footsteps moving slowly through the halls. In the early hours before dawn, Isabelle's eyes fluttered open. She hadn't meant to fall asleep, but had drifted off without realizing. The house was quieter now, the storm outside having died down to a light drizzle. But something had woken her, a noise she couldn't place. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding in the darkness. There it was again, a soft thud, followed by the faintest creak of wood under pressure. Isabelle's pulse quickened as she listened, her body frozen in the stillness of the room. The sound was coming from below, near the stairs. She slid out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and moved toward the hallway. The house was still now, so quiet that every step she took seemed deafening in the silence. She reached the top of the staircase and looked down into the darkness below. The faint glow of moonlight filtered in through the windows, just enough to cast long, eerie shadows across the floor. For a moment, she hesitated, her hand gripping the banister. The sound came again, a faint but deliberate creak, like something, moving slowly down the stairs. The air felt heavier, pressing against her skin, filling the space around her with a suffocating tension. Isabelle took a deep breath and descended the stairs slowly, her heart racing with each step. The old wood groaned beneath her weight, echoing through the empty house. As she reached the landing, she paused, listening intently. The sound had stopped, leaving only the soft patter of rain on the windows and the distant murmur of the wind outside. She stood there, in the dark hallway at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes scanning the shadows. The house was silent again, but the tension remained, a lingering presence that she couldn't shake. Isabelle moved cautiously down the hall, her steps light and careful, as if she might disturb whatever had made the noise. The stairs that led to the basement were tucked away at the far end of the house, behind a door that was almost hidden in the shadows. Isabelle had avoided them so far, feeling no need to explore the dark, damp space below. But now, standing in front of the door, she felt a pull, a sense that something was waiting for her down there. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold to the touch, sending a shiver up her arm. She turned it slowly, the latch clicking open with a soft, metallic sound. The door swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness below. Isabelle hesitated, the air around her growing colder as she peered into the blackness. The faint smell of damp earth and old wood wafted up from the basement, filling her nose with a musty, ancient odor. She could see the outline of the steps leading down, but beyond that, everything was shrouded in shadow. Taking a deep breath, she descended the stairs one step at a time, each creak of the wood beneath her feet sending a wave of unease through her. The air grew thicker as she went, the darkness closing in around her like a heavy blanket. When she reached the bottom, she paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The basement was larger than she had expected, a long, low-ceilinged space filled with old furniture, broken crates, and dusty shelves. The walls were lined with stone, their rough surface cold and damp to the touch. The ceiling sagged in places, and cobwebs hung in thick clusters from the beams above. Isabelle moved through the space cautiously, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of what had made the noise. But the basement was silent now, the air still and oppressive. As she stepped further into the room, her foot caught on something, a small, round object that rolled away with a soft clatter. She crouched down, her fingers brushing against the cold stone floor until they found the object. It was a marble, smooth and perfectly round, its surface cool against her skin. She held it up to the faint light, turning it over in her hand. The marble was old, worn smooth by years of handling, its once vibrant colors now faded and dull. A chill ran down Isabelle's spine as she stood up, the marble still clutched in her hand. Something about it felt wrong, as if it didn't belong here. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught something else, something hidden in the shadows near the far wall. A door. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of old boxes, its wooden surface warped and cracked from years of neglect. Isabelle hadn't noticed it before, but now, standing in the dim light of the basement, she felt drawn to it. The air around her seemed to grow colder as she approached, each step sending a wave of unease through her. The door was barely taller than she was, its frame crooked and uneven. It didn't look like it had been opened in years. Isabelle reached for the handle, her fingers brushing against the rough wood. The door didn't have a lock, but it was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. She pulled harder, her heart racing in her chest, and with a sudden creak, the door swung open. The space beyond was narrow and dark, a small crawl space that seemed to stretch on for several feet before disappearing into the shadows. The air was thick and stale, and the smell of damp earth filled her nose. Isabelle crouched down, peering into the narrow tunnel, her pulse quickening. There was something at the far end of the space, something small and indistinct, barely visible in the gloom. Isabelle hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with thoughts of what could be waiting for her. But curiosity, and the ever-present pull of the house, drove her forward. She crawled into the narrow space, her body pressing against the cold, damp walls. The air was suffocating, the darkness absolute as she moved deeper into the tunnel. The sound of her own breathing filled her ears, echoing in the confined space. As she reached the end, her hand brushed against something soft. Isabelle recoiled instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. Her fingers touched it again, more carefully this time, and she realized it was fabric, an old, tattered piece of cloth wrapped around something solid. Her heart raced as she pulled the object free from the dirt. It was small and square, wrapped tightly in the decaying cloth. Isabelle sat back on her heels, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps as she stared at the bundle in her hands. She knew, without opening it, that whatever was inside would change everything. Isabelle turned and crawled back out of the crawl space, her pulse thundering in her ears. The house was silent now, the whispers gone, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing as she emerged into the dim light of the basement. The small, wrapped object sat heavily in her lap as she knelt on the cold stone floor, her hands trembling. She didn't know what she had found, but deep down, she knew it was just the beginning. The house had shown her this for a reason, and whatever secrets it held, they were far from over. Isabelle stood slowly, the small bundle clutched tightly in her hands, and made her way back up the stairs, leaving the dark basement behind. The house was waiting. Chapter 5. The Presence. The house had grown eerily still since Isabelle's discovery in the basement. The bundle she had unearthed weighed heavily on her mind as she placed it on the table in the kitchen, her hands still trembling from the experience. The decaying cloth that covered it was brittle, as if it had been buried for decades, its dark fibers crumbling with the slightest touch. Isabelle sat in the dim light, staring at the small object, her pulse quickening with the anticipation of what it might contain. There was something unsettling about the way it had been hidden, wrapped tightly and placed at the end of a forgotten crawl space. It wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted it concealed, lost to time. But now it was hers, and the weight of that discovery hung over her like a shadow. Outside, the rain had started again, lightly tapping on the windows, its rhythm steady but somehow distant, as though the house itself absorbed the sound. Isabelle's fingers grazed the edge of the cloth, her mind racing. She wanted to unwrap it, to uncover whatever lay beneath. But a cold dread held her back. The air around her felt dense, thick with an unseen presence, as if the very walls of the house were watching her. For hours, she left the bundle untouched, pacing the small confines of the kitchen, trying to distract herself from the gnawing curiosity that clawed at her. The whispers in the house had grown silent, but that only made the atmosphere more oppressive. The once faint murmur of the house had become an unbroken stillness, and in that silence, Isabelle could feel something. Someone, looming just out of sight. The day passed in a blur of anxious pacing and restless waiting. The longer she stayed in the house, the more it seemed to change. The shadows, once familiar, now twisted in strange ways, stretching along the floors and walls as if they were alive. The light coming in from the windows appeared weaker, almost as if the house was swallowing it whole, refusing to let anything from the outside break its hold over her. Nightfall came slowly, the darkness creeping in through every crack and corner of the old house. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. Isabelle sat back at the table, the bundle still before her, untouched but ever present. The urge to unwrap it gnawed at her with every passing second, but there was a part of her that knew. Once she did, there would be no going back. Her hands shook slightly as she reached out and carefully began to peel away the cloth. The fabric crumbled under her touch, revealing something solid and smooth beneath. Piece by piece, she unwrapped it, her breath catching in her throat as the final layer fell away. A small, wooden box sat on the table, no larger than her hand, its surface worn but intact. It was plain, unadorned, with no markings or symbols to indicate its origin. The wood was dark, polished smooth by time, but it felt heavy, far too heavy for something of its size. Isabelle ran her fingers along the edges of the box, searching for a way to open it. There were no hinges, no visible latch, but the box felt sealed, as if whatever lay inside had been locked away for a reason. The sense of foreboding that had followed her since her discovery in the basement intensified, settling deep in her chest. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind slammed against the windows, rattling the glass and shaking the house. Isabelle jumped, her heart pounding as the sudden force reverberated through the walls. The lights flickered, the dim bulbs casting strange, twisting shadows across the room before stabilizing again. But something had changed. The air felt colder, a biting chill that seeped into her skin. The house, once filled with creaks and groans, now stood in absolute silence. Even the wind outside seemed to have died down, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Isabelle looked around, her eyes scanning the room, but everything appeared as it had before. Except now, the house didn't feel empty. It was as if something had entered with the wind, something unseen, hovering just beyond her reach. The presence was subtle at first, a faint pressure in the air, but it grew stronger with each passing moment, settling over her like a weight. Isabelle could feel it, lurking in the corners, just out of sight. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, a cold, unsettling awareness that tightened her chest and quickened her breath. She turned back to the box, her hands trembling as she lifted it off the table. The weight of it surprised her, its heaviness far greater than it should have been. She pressed her fingers against the smooth surface, hoping for some hidden mechanism that would reveal its contents, but the box remained stubbornly closed. The air in the room grew colder still, the chill settling deep into Isabelle's bones. The shadows around her seemed to stretch and shift, moving in ways that defied the faint light of the kitchen lamp. The feeling of the presence in the house intensified, wrapping around her like an invisible hand, pressing in from all sides. Isabelle's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she clutched the box tightly in her hands. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the presence grew stronger, more tangible. Every instinct told her to leave, to abandon the box, the house, everything, but she couldn't move. The weight of the presence held her in place, rooted to the spot. For what felt like an eternity, she stood there, her heart racing in her chest, waiting for something to happen. The room was still, the air thick with tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Isabelle's gaze drifted to the shadows on the walls, where they seemed to pulse and shift, alive with some unseen force. Suddenly, the box in her hands grew warm, the wood heating beneath her fingers as if responding to the presence in the room. Isabelle gasped, nearly dropping it as the heat surged through her skin. The warmth spread quickly, filling the box with an unnatural energy that hummed against her palms. She could feel it now. Whatever was inside, it was alive. Her pulse quickened as the warmth intensified, pulsing in time with her racing heartbeat. The presence in the house seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching longer, darker, until they nearly engulfed her. Isabelle's vision blurred as the room spun, the box growing impossibly heavy in her hands. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The warmth vanished, the shadows stilled. The presence, that oppressive weight that had filled the house, lifted, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the wind outside. Isabelle stood there, breathless, her hands still gripping the now cool surface of the box. The room was as it had been, the oppressive tension gone, but the air still felt charged, as if the house was waiting for something. Slowly, cautiously, Isabelle set the box back down on the table, her hands shaking. She backed away from it, her heart still racing, her mind filled with questions she couldn't begin to answer. The house, silent once more, loomed around her like a waiting predator, its secrets still hidden in the darkness. The presence was gone, for now, but Isabelle knew it would return. And when it did, the house would demand more. Chapter 6. The Mirror. The storm had passed, but the house remained steeped in an uneasy stillness. The presence that had pressed so heavily against Isabelle the night before seemed to have retreated, though the tension lingered in the air, like the static before a lightning strike. Isabelle hadn't slept. The strange wooden box still sat on the kitchen table, untouched since the eerie warmth had surged through it. Her mind buzzed with questions, but she didn't dare open it. Instead, she wandered the house aimlessly, her footsteps echoing through the hallways, her eyes constantly drawn to the shifting shadows that seemed to follow her. The sense of being watched hadn't left her. It had only grown more intense, as if whatever had made its presence known was now silently observing her every move. The sun was low in the sky, casting a pale, golden light through the windows. Dust particles floated lazily in the beams, giving the air a hazy, dreamlike quality. Isabelle moved through the house, feeling the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. There were rooms she hadn't yet explored, corners she hadn't dared to investigate, but something inside her told her she couldn't avoid them any longer. The mirror on the second floor had caught her attention the moment she arrived, though she hadn't given it much thought until now. It stood in the hallway outside one of the smaller bedrooms, an antique piece with an intricately carved wooden frame, its surface marred with age. It wasn't particularly large, but it was imposing nonetheless, and now, with the strange events swirling around her, it seemed to hold a greater significance. Isabelle climbed the stairs slowly, the creaking of the old wood underfoot echoing through the quiet house. As she reached the landing, her gaze was immediately drawn to the mirror. The sunlight reflected off its surface, creating an odd shimmer that seemed almost unnatural. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she studied the glass. The reflection that stared back at her was familiar, but there was something subtly wrong. Isabelle couldn't place it at first, but the longer she looked, the more unsettled she became. Her reflection seemed off. It was her, and yet it wasn't. The image was ever so slightly distorted, as if the mirror was warping reality just enough to make her doubt what she saw. She leaned in, her face inches from the glass. The shadows behind her stretched long in the dim light, their shapes moving in strange, unnatural ways. Her reflection remained still, but something about it felt alive, watching her with a cold, detached gaze. A chill crawled up her spine as she stepped back, the unsettling sensation growing stronger. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the hallway was empty. Only the silence of the house greeted her. The air seemed heavier now, colder, as if the mirror itself was drawing the warmth from the room. Isabelle turned back to the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. Her reflection stared back at her, but now there was no mistaking it. Something was wrong. The figure in the mirror, though identical to her in every way, didn't feel like her. The eyes, though the same shade and shape, lacked the life and warmth she knew they held. They were cold, almost lifeless, like the reflection was a hollow version of herself. Her pulse quickened as she reached out, her hand hovering just above the surface of the glass. The air between her fingers and the mirror felt charged, electric, like the faint hum of static before a storm. As her fingertips brushed against the cold surface, she recoiled instinctively, the glass unnaturally cold to the touch. The shadows behind her reflection seemed to shift again, moving of their own accord, though nothing in the hallway had changed. The dark shapes twisted and writhed in the background, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were trying to reach for her. Isabelle backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The house, once oppressive in its silence, now felt suffocating. The presence she had felt before was stronger here, concentrated around the mirror, its weight pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She turned and hurried back down the hallway, her heart racing as she put as much distance as possible between herself and the eerie reflection. But the feeling of being watched followed her, clinging to her like a shadow she couldn't shake. No matter how far she went, the presence was there, lurking just out of sight. As she descended the stairs, her thoughts raced. The mirror wasn't just an old, forgotten relic. It was connected to the house's strange energy. The shifting shadows, the oppressive presence, the box in the kitchen. It was all connected. But how? And why? Isabelle reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, her hand resting on the banister. She felt lightheaded, as if the air in the house had grown too thin, too stale. The overwhelming sense of dread settled over her like a heavy blanket, wrapping her in its suffocating embrace. She needed to leave the house. The thought struck her suddenly, a sharp, undeniable instinct that pushed her toward the front door. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to get out, to run as far from the house as she could, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Something was keeping her there. The box. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen, where the small wooden box still sat on the table, untouched. The presence seemed to radiate from it, a dark, malevolent energy that pulsed through the walls of the house. Isabelle knew, deep down, that leaving the box behind wasn't an option. Whatever was happening in the house, whatever force had taken hold of it, the box was at the center of it all. She forced herself to move, her legs heavy as she made her way into the kitchen. The box seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as though it were alive, feeding off the fear that now consumed her. Isabelle stood over the table, her hand trembling as she reached for the box. The warmth from the night before was gone, replaced by a cold, lifeless chill that seeped through her fingers as soon as she touched it. The lid was still sealed, but she could feel the weight of whatever was inside, pressing against the wood, waiting to be freed. She didn't know what to do. Every instinct told her to leave it alone, to walk away from the house and never return. But something deep within her pushed her forward. The house wasn't just a place. It was a presence, a force that had been waiting for her, drawing her in from the moment she had arrived. And now, it wouldn't let her go. The mirror, the box, the presence. It all circled back to the same dark force that had wrapped itself around her life. Isabelle felt trapped, as though the house had woven an invisible web that now held her tightly in its grasp. She turned slowly, her gaze falling on the hallway mirror. Though she couldn't see it from the kitchen, she could feel its pull, like a pair of cold, unseen eyes watching her from the shadows. The reflection that wasn't quite hers had stayed in her mind, haunting her with its empty, hollow stare. As night began to fall once again, the house grew darker, colder, and Isabelle knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever the house wanted, it wasn't finished with her yet. Chapter 7. The Night Tremors. The night had settled over the house like a suffocating blanket, thick with an unnatural silence. The wind outside barely stirred, and the distant hum of the world seemed to have vanished, leaving only the oppressive stillness within the walls. Isabelle sat in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that the house itself was alive, breathing around her. She hadn't touched the box again. After her encounter with the mirror earlier in the day, she had retreated to her room, closing the door behind her as if it could protect her from the house's looming presence. But the sensation of being watched had followed her, lingering in the air like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, shadows seemed to creep into her mind, pulling her into a dark, endless void. The air in the room felt dense, thick with an energy she couldn't explain, and every creak of the floorboards sent a shiver down her spine. As she lay there, motionless, the temperature in the room dropped, the cold seeping into her skin like a layer of frost. The blankets did nothing to keep the chill at bay, and the small bedside lamp, casting a faint yellow glow, only served to make the shadows seem deeper, more alive. The corners of the room shifted in the dim light, the edges of the furniture blurring as if they were melting into the darkness. Her heartbeat was slow, deliberate, each thud echoing in her ears like the ticking of a clock. Time seemed to stretch on, endless and torturous, as she waited for something to happen. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Maybe the next strange occurrence, the next sign of the house's malevolent force, but every muscle in her body was tense, bracing for the inevitable. And then, the tremors began. At first, it was subtle, a low vibration, barely perceptible, running through the floorboards beneath her. Isabelle's eyes darted to the ceiling, searching for the source of the disturbance, but the house remained still. She pressed her hand against the mattress, feeling the faint tremor running through the bed, as if the entire structure of the house was gently shaking, like a living thing trying to shake off an unseen weight. The vibrations grew stronger, their rhythm irregular, as if something deep within the house had stirred, waking from a long slumber. The walls seemed to hum with energy, the faint rattle of picture frames and loose objects a warning of the growing force beneath her feet. Isabelle sat up, her heart pounding now, her breath shallow as the air in the room grew colder still. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the freezing hardwood floor. The tremors vibrated through her body, sending a shudder up her spine. The house felt alive, its pulse quickening in sync with her own, as though whatever lurked beneath its surface was now rising to the surface. A creak in the hallway made her freeze, her heart skipping a beat. The sound was faint, but distinct, like the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone, or something, moving through the house. Isabelle strained her ears, her entire body tense as she listened for more. The footsteps were slow, methodical, coming closer with every second. Her eyes flickered to the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained closed. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was in the hallway was taking its time, savoring the moment. Isabelle's breath caught in her throat as the sound reached the door. She held her breath, waiting for the handle to turn, for the door to creak open, but nothing happened. The house went still again. The tremors had stopped, and the footsteps had ceased, leaving behind only the deafening silence. Isabelle's pulse thundered in her ears as she waited, her body trembling with fear, but the door remained untouched. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Slowly, cautiously, she rose from the bed, her legs weak beneath her. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she tiptoed to the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. She had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side, but she couldn't stay locked in her room, paralyzed by fear. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The air outside her room was even colder, almost biting as it brushed against her skin. She took a hesitant step into the hall, her heart racing as she glanced around, searching for any sign of movement. The hallway was empty. The long stretch of floorboards leading toward the staircase was bathed in faint moonlight, the shadows stretching in strange, elongated shapes along the walls. Everything was still, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, as if the very shadows themselves were alive, lurking just out of sight. Isabelle's eyes drifted toward the end of the hallway, where the mirror stood. The dim light reflected off its surface, casting a faint glow that made the surrounding shadows seem even more unnatural. Her reflection in the mirror seemed far away, distorted by the strange light and the house's energy, but she couldn't bring herself to approach it again. She stepped back, her bare feet cold against the hardwood, and turned toward the staircase. Every instinct told her to leave, to run out of the house and never return, but something kept her rooted to the spot. She felt drawn to the source of the tremors, to whatever was waking beneath the house, as if it had some claim on her now. The stairs creaked beneath her weight as she descended, her heart pounding louder with each step. The air grew heavier as she reached the ground floor, thick with an oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes scanning the darkened living room. Nothing. The house was silent, the tremors gone, but the sense of foreboding was stronger than ever. Isabelle moved toward the kitchen, where the box still sat on the table, untouched since the day before. The cold from the basement seemed to creep up through the floor, seeping into the room like a rising tide. She approached the box cautiously, her hands trembling as she reached for it. The wooden surface was smooth and cold beneath her fingers, and as she lifted it from the table, she felt that strange vibration again. Faint, but unmistakable. The box hummed with a dark energy, as though it held the very essence of the house's secrets. Isabelle turned, her gaze drifting toward the basement door. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pulse, alive with the same energy that had sent tremors through the house. She felt drawn to it, as if the house itself was urging her forward, pulling her toward whatever lay beneath. Her heart raced as she reached for the basement door, her hand hovering over the handle. The cold radiating from the door was intense, biting into her skin like ice, but she couldn't pull away. The presence in the house seemed to coil around her, tightening its grip as she slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, yawning stairwell below. The cold air rushed out, wrapping around her like a shroud, and for a moment, Isabelle hesitated. But something deeper, something primal, pushed her forward. Clutching the box tightly in her hands, she descended into the darkness, each step echoing through the silent house. The air grew colder with every step, the oppressive weight of the house's presence pressing down on her shoulders like an unseen hand. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused, her breath visible in the freezing air. The basement stretched out before her, a black void filled with the faintest of movements, like shadows shifting in the periphery of her vision. Isabelle's pulse quickened as she took a step forward, her footfall barely audible against the icy stone floor. The house was waiting. Whatever had stirred beneath its surface was watching her now, biding its time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And Isabelle, drawn deeper into its grip, knew that moment was fast approaching. Chapter 8. The Hidden Room. The basement was a world of its own, far removed from the rest of the house. The damp air clung to Isabelle's skin, and the shadows seemed denser here, as though the darkness was thick enough to swallow the faintest glimmers of light. She held the wooden box tightly, its strange vibration pulsing through her fingertips. The cold stone beneath her feet felt like ice, sending chills up her spine with every step she took into the dark, cavernous space. The basement was far larger than she had anticipated. The dim light from the staircase barely illuminated the rows of shelves and old furniture, their shapes grotesque and unfamiliar in the gloom. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten veils, swaying gently in the stagnant air, while old boxes and tools littered the corners, covered in thick layers of dust. But none of that held her attention. It was the far end of the room that pulled her forward, where the shadows seemed even darker, deeper, as if something was hiding just out of sight. She moved cautiously, her breath shallow, her pulse quickening with every step. The presence she had felt throughout the house was stronger here, almost palpable, like an invisible force pressing down on her. Isabelle scanned the walls, her eyes catching on a faint outline barely visible in the gloom. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, just another shadow among the many that danced across the walls. But as she moved closer, the shape became clearer. A door, hidden and almost imperceptible, tucked into the farthest corner of the basement. The door was old, far older than the rest of the house, with heavy iron hinges and a thick, rough-hewn frame that seemed out of place in the modern world. Isabelle's heart pounded in her chest as she stood before it, her breath catching in her throat. The wood of the door was dark, aged with time, and covered in strange markings, symbols that she didn't recognize, etched deeply into the surface as though carved by something ancient. She reached out, her hand trembling as her fingers brushed against the cold wood. A wave of dread washed over her, but she couldn't pull away. The house had led her here. This hidden door, this forgotten room. It was all part of the puzzle that had drawn her deeper into the darkness. With a deep breath, she grasped the iron handle. It was cold, almost painfully so, and as she pulled, the door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, revealing a yawning blackness beyond. The air inside the hidden room was even colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something rotten, like decay. Isabelle hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But the box in her hands pulsed again, the vibration stronger now, urging her forward. She stepped through the doorway, the darkness closing in around her like a suffocating shroud. The walls of the room were rough stone, unlike the rest of the house, and the floor beneath her feet was packed dirt. There was no light here, no windows, only the cold, impenetrable blackness. As her eyes adjusted, she began to make out faint shapes in the gloom. The room wasn't large, but it felt vast, the oppressive darkness making it seem as though it stretched on forever. In the center of the room was an altar, or at least, something that resembled one. A large stone slab, covered in dust and cobwebs, but unmistakably worn from years of use. The symbols on the altar matched those carved into the door, strange and unnerving, twisting in ways that hurt her eyes when she tried to focus on them. There was something ancient about this place, something dark and forgotten, hidden beneath the layers of the house for generations. Isabelle moved closer, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she reached the altar. The box in her hands vibrated more intensely now, as though it was reacting to the presence of the room itself. She set the box down on the altar, her hands trembling as the cold air wrapped around her like a vice. The moment the box touched the stone, the air shifted. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls and floor, as if the very foundations of the house were alive, responding to the box's presence. Isabelle stepped back, her heart racing as the hum grew louder, more intense, until it became a deep, guttural sound, like a growl reverberating through the ground. She watched, frozen in place, as the box began to shift. The wood creaked, the lid moving slightly, as though whatever was inside was finally ready to reveal itself. The symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, their twisted shapes illuminated by a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the vibration. Isabelle's chest tightened as a cold, unseen force seemed to fill the room, pressing against her from all sides. The air was heavy, suffocating, and she could feel the presence she had sensed in the house growing stronger, more defined. It was no longer just a vague feeling. It was real, tangible, and it was coming from the box. Suddenly, the lid of the box snapped open with a deafening crack, the sound echoing through the room like a thunderclap. The green light flared, blinding her for a moment, and when her vision cleared, she saw something rising from the box. A dark, swirling mass of shadows, shifting and writhing like a living thing. The shadows coalesced into a shape, vaguely human but distorted, its form stretching and twisting unnaturally. It hovered above the altar, its face, or what passed for a face, an empty void of darkness, featureless and terrifying. Isabelle stumbled backward, her heart racing as the shadowy figure slowly turned toward her. The presence in the room was overwhelming now, filling every inch of the space with a malevolent energy that made it hard to breathe. The figure moved toward her, its form shifting and stretching, reaching out with long, shadowy tendrils that seemed to melt into the darkness around it. She tried to move, to run, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the very air around her had solidified, trapping her in place. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating, and she could feel the coldness radiating from it, seeping into her bones. As the figure reached out, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around her, Isabelle's vision began to blur. The edges of the room faded into darkness, and her body grew heavy, her limbs numb from the cold. She fought to stay conscious, to keep her mind clear, but the darkness was too strong, too overwhelming. Just as the figure's tendrils tightened around her, the box snapped shut with a loud bang. The figure vanished, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The green light from the symbols on the altar faded, leaving the room in total darkness once again. Isabelle collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, her body trembling from the cold and the terror that had gripped her. The presence in the room had receded, but she knew it hadn't gone far. Whatever had been inside the box was still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike again. She lay on the cold dirt floor for what felt like hours, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. The hidden room, the altar, the shadows. All of it was connected to the house, to the box, to the presence that had been growing stronger since she first arrived. Isabelle knew she had uncovered something far more sinister than she could have imagined. The house's secrets were deeper than she had realized, and the darkness that had been awakened was far from finished with her. As she struggled to her feet, her body weak and unsteady, she realized that whatever was in the house, whatever force had taken hold of it, wasn't going to let her go. And now, she had to find a way to escape before it was too late. Chapter 9. The Awakening. Isabelle pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to steady herself. The hidden room felt oppressive, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, and she knew she couldn't stay there any longer. The shadows that had danced around her just moments ago were still lurking at the edges of her mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that had been unleashed. She forced herself to turn away from the altar, the remnants of the dark presence still clinging to the air around her. The door stood ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling into the room from the hallway outside. It beckoned her, a lifeline pulling her away from the suffocating darkness that had engulfed her. With trembling legs, Isabelle pushed herself off the wall and stumbled toward the door. Each step felt like wading through a thick fog, her body heavy with the weight of fear and dread. The air outside felt fresher, almost a relief, and she stepped back into the hallway, the light from the staircase washing over her. But the moment she left the hidden room, a sense of foreboding washed over her. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the corners of her vision, always just out of reach. Isabelle's heart raced as she made her way back to the staircase, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She had to get out of the house, away from the darkness that was threatening to consume her. As she climbed the stairs, her hands shook, and she gripped the railing tightly, forcing herself to move. Each creak of the floorboards echoed in the stillness, amplifying her anxiety. The house felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to throb in time with her heartbeat. Isabelle glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from the hidden room following her, but the hallway remained empty. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused, taking a moment to catch her breath. The hallway stretched before her, the dim light casting elongated shadows on the walls. She hesitated, unsure of her next move. The living room lay at the end of the corridor, and she could feel the magnetic pull of the front door, the promise of escape tantalizingly close. But the house was vast, filled with secrets, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished with her yet. With determination, Isabelle made her way to the living room. As she entered, the familiar scent of the old furniture filled her nostrils, but the room felt different now, heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The flickering light of the lamp danced across the walls, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and turned, morphing into shapes that made her skin crawl. Her eyes darted to the windows, the darkness outside growing thicker as the night deepened. She needed to leave, but something held her back, a nagging sensation that there was still something she had to confront, something she had yet to understand. Isabelle turned her attention to the box, which still sat on the coffee table. The lid closed, but the air around it still humming with energy. She had to know what was inside. The urge to open it again was overwhelming, like an itch she couldn't scratch. But she remembered the shadow, the tendrils that had reached for her, and fear crept back into her heart. She took a step closer, drawn to the box against her better judgment. As she reached for it, the temperature in the room dropped, a chill creeping up her spine as the shadows began to shift more violently, swirling in the corners of her vision. Her hand hesitated above the box, uncertainty flooding her thoughts. What if opening it again unleashed something worse? But she couldn't walk away, not now. The box felt like the key to understanding the house, to understanding the darkness that had taken hold. She needed to face it, to confront whatever was lurking inside. With a deep breath, she grasped the lid, feeling the coldness seep into her skin. The moment she lifted the lid, the energy in the room shifted. The box emitted a low hum, reverberating through the air as if it were alive. A dark mist began to pour out, swirling around her feet, wrapping around her ankles like a serpent. She stepped back, fear coursing through her veins, but she couldn't look away. The mist thickened, rising higher, coiling around her, forming shapes that whispered of long-forgotten secrets. Isabelle felt the darkness beckoning her, urging her to step closer, to dive deeper into its depths. The mist thickened, and she could see faint images swirling within it. Faces, places, and events long past. Each image flickered and shifted, stories unfolding before her eyes, tales of despair and sorrow that resonated deep within her soul. She forced herself to breathe, to remain calm despite the overwhelming sensation. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind with echoes of the past. She felt the weight of history pressing down on her, the lives that had been lived within the walls of the house, the pain and suffering that lingered like ghosts. And then, amidst the swirling mist, she saw it, a figure that stood out among the chaos, a shadow that was familiar yet terrifying. It was the same dark figure that had emerged from the box in the hidden room, but now it seemed different. Its form was clearer, more defined, and as it reached out toward her, she felt a jolt of recognition. The memories surged forth, flooding her mind like a tidal wave. She was no longer just a spectator. She was part of the story, woven into the very fabric of the house. The figure was an echo of someone who had once lived there, a soul trapped within the darkness, seeking release. Isabelle understood now that this wasn't just about her. It was about all the lives that had been intertwined with this house, all the pain that had been buried beneath its surface. As the mist thickened, the figure grew more distinct. Isabelle could see the outline of a face, twisted in anguish, eyes filled with a sorrow that transcended time. She felt the pull of its grief, the weight of its sorrow pressing down on her, and for a moment, she wanted to reach out, to offer solace, to understand. But then, a sudden darkness washed over her, pushing the figure back into the depths of the mist. The shadows in the room grew restless, swirling violently around her, and she felt the presence of the house closing in, tightening its grip. Panic surged within her as the darkness threatened to consume her. Isabelle stumbled backward, tearing her gaze from the box as she sought refuge in the living room. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, urging her to stay, to give in to the darkness. But she couldn't. She had to escape. She turned and ran toward the front door, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The shadows writhed behind her, the air growing colder as they surged forward, hungry for her fear. Isabelle grasped the doorknob, her fingers slick with sweat, and twisted it with all her might. The door creaked open, revealing the night outside. The cool air hit her like a wave, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness of the house. She hesitated for a split second, looking back at the house that had held her captive, and then she bolted through the door, the weight of the shadows lifting as she crossed the threshold. The night enveloped her, stars twinkling overhead like distant beacons of hope. Isabelle ran, her feet pounding against the cold ground, the grass slick with dew. She didn't look back as she fled into the darkness, her heart racing, the sounds of the house fading into the distance. The shadows had been unleashed, but she was free, for now. The darkness would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for another opportunity to strike. But Isabelle had tasted freedom, and she wouldn't let the house claim her again. She would uncover the secrets it held, but on her own terms, far from its suffocating grasp. As she sprinted into the night, she could still feel the remnants of the house clinging to her, the shadows whispering in her mind. The awakening was far from over, and she knew she had only scratched the surface of the darkness that lay ahead. But she was determined to face it, no matter the cost. The house might have awakened, but she would not be its prisoner. Chapter 10. The Pursuit. Isabelle ran through the night, her feet pounding against the soft earth, the chill of the air biting into her skin. Each breath was a struggle, her lungs burning as she pushed herself forward, fueled by adrenaline and fear. The darkness of the forest surrounded her, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Moonlight filtered through the leaves, casting eerie shadows that danced around her, whispering of unseen dangers lurking in the depths. The house loomed behind her, its silhouette a dark presence against the night sky, a reminder of the terror she had escaped. But as she ran, a sense of unease settled deep in her stomach. The darkness had followed her, an invisible force weaving through the trees, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. It was as if the very shadows were sentient, hungry for her fear, and the further she ran, the more she could feel them closing in. Her heart raced as she navigated the winding path through the forest, branches scraping against her arms, the underbrush tangling around her feet. She needed to find safety, to escape the clutches of whatever dark presence had taken hold of the house. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow on the landscape, but the light felt inadequate, struggling to penetrate the oppressive darkness. After what felt like an eternity, she stumbled into a clearing. The ground was soft and covered in grass, the moonlight bathing the area in a gentle light. Isabelle paused, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she scanned her surroundings. She needed to rest, to gather her thoughts and figure out her next move. But the feeling of being watched persisted, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She knelt in the grass, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. Images of the house flooded her memory, the hidden room, the altar, the shadowy figure that had reached out for her. What was it trying to tell her? Why had it stirred to life in her presence? The weight of its sorrow lingered, pulling at her heart. As she sat in the clearing, the sounds of the forest enveloped her. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft scuttling of creatures hidden in the underbrush. But beneath it all, she could hear something else, an echo, a whisper that tugged at her consciousness. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, resonating through the stillness of the night, intertwining with her thoughts. The shadows were relentless, and they were searching for her. Suddenly, a rustling noise broke through the tranquility of the clearing, sending a jolt of fear through Isabelle. She whipped her head around, heart pounding, scanning the trees for movement. The shadows were alive, shifting and swirling, creeping closer to the edges of the clearing. Panic gripped her once more, and she scrambled to her feet, instincts kicking in. With renewed determination, Isabelle turned and fled again, weaving between the trees, her heart racing as she felt the presence behind her intensifying. The whispers were no longer just in her mind. They echoed through the forest, a cacophony of voices that called to her, urging her to stop. She couldn't. She wouldn't. The house had awakened something within her, and she had to find a way to put it to rest. The underbrush tore at her clothes as she plunged deeper into the forest, branches snapping underfoot, the sounds of the night becoming a blur. The shadows trailed her, their dark tendrils curling around her, reaching out with an insatiable hunger. She could almost feel them grazing her skin, a cold touch that sent shivers down her spine. As she navigated the maze of trees, she began to realize she was running in circles, the landscape shifting around her in a disorienting dance. Panic rose in her throat as she recognized familiar trees, their twisted trunks and gnarled branches mocking her. She was trapped in a web of shadows, the darkness closing in on her from all sides. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices that echoed in her mind, each word indistinguishable yet resonating with an undeniable urgency. The darkness was hungry for her fear, and it was feeding off her desperation. Isabelle's heart raced, her thoughts spiraling as she fought to regain control. She needed to remember, to focus on what had happened in the house, to uncover the truth hidden within its walls. Then she saw it, a flicker of light through the trees. It was faint but unmistakable, a beacon calling to her amid the oppressive darkness. Hope ignited within her, pushing back the fear that threatened to consume her. She sprinted toward the light, adrenaline propelling her forward as the shadows surged behind her, angry and relentless. The light grew brighter as she approached, illuminating the clearing ahead. It was a small cabin, weathered and worn, standing defiantly against the encroaching darkness. Relief washed over her as she stumbled through the underbrush and reached the door, her fingers trembling as she grasped the handle. Isabelle pushed the door open, the wood creaking in protest as she stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from the ceiling, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Dust motes danced in the air, and the scent of old wood and forgotten memories filled her nostrils. It felt like a refuge, a sanctuary from the chaos outside. But the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt it. The darkness had followed her, seeping into the corners of the cabin like a fog. She quickly closed the door behind her, locking it tight, but the shadows pressed against the windows, eager to breach the sanctuary she had found. The whispers intensified, echoing off the walls, drowning out her thoughts. Isabelle took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down as she scanned the small cabin. There was a single window on one wall, its glass cracked and dusty, and a rickety table in the center of the room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, their spines cracked and faded. In the far corner, a fireplace lay cold and empty, the ashes long gone. She moved toward the table, her heart still racing as she rifled through the scattered papers and trinkets. Among the clutter, she found a weathered journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it, the faint scent of musty paper wafting toward her, and began to read. The entries were filled with notes about the house, the land it stood upon, and the darkness that had plagued its inhabitants for generations. A story of sorrow and despair unfolded before her eyes, detailing the lives of those who had come before her. Families torn apart, secrets buried in the walls, and a lingering darkness that seemed to feed off their pain. As she flipped through the pages, she found sketches of the symbols she had seen on the altar, accompanied by frantic notes warning of the dangers of awakening the shadows. Isabelle's heart sank as she realized the gravity of what she had uncovered. The house was a vessel for the darkness, a place where despair and grief coalesced into something sinister. She felt a pang of guilt wash over her. Had she unwittingly disturbed something that had lain dormant for years? The shadows that had awakened were not just remnants of the past. They were the echoes of those who had suffered, trapped in a cycle of despair. Isabelle closed the journal, her mind racing as she considered her options. She couldn't leave the cabin, not yet. The darkness was relentless, and she knew it would find her if she ventured back into the night. But she couldn't hide forever. She had to confront the shadows, to understand what they wanted from her, to put the past to rest once and for all. As she sat at the table, the weight of the journal heavy in her hands, she could feel the whispers intensifying, urging her to act. She had awakened the darkness, and now it was time to face the consequences. The house had become a part of her story, and she couldn't turn her back on it. With renewed determination, Isabelle set the journal aside and stood up. She moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass into the night beyond. The shadows lingered just outside, coiling and shifting, but they were not as threatening from this vantage point. She felt a flicker of hope amidst the despair. She turned back to the cabin, taking in her surroundings one last time. She would find a way to confront the darkness, to uncover the truth behind the whispers. The cabin was her sanctuary for now, but it was also the starting point for the journey ahead. Isabelle took a deep breath, ready to face whatever awaited her. The pursuit had only just begun. and she was determined to uncover the secrets that lay buried within the shadows. She would not let fear dictate her path any longer. The house would be confronted, its darkness challenged, and she would emerge victorious. Chapter 11. The Darkness Within. The cabin was filled with an eerie stillness, the kind that made the air feel heavy and charged with anticipation. Isabelle stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the swirling shadows that danced outside. They moved with a life of their own, twisting and turning like smoke caught in a breeze, beckoning her to step outside, to join them in the abyss. But she remained steadfast, rooted to the spot, her resolve hardening as she prepared for what lay ahead. With a determined breath, Isabelle turned away from the window and walked to the center of the room. The journal lay open on the table, its pages filled with the secrets of the past. She needed to remember the stories that haunted this place, the souls that had been trapped within the shadows. The weight of their pain bore down on her, but she was not afraid. She would face the darkness head-on. As she began to examine the pages more closely, she noticed a symbol drawn in the margin, a circle with intricate patterns radiating from its center. It was the same symbol she had seen in the hidden room of the house, surrounded by the candles and offerings. The journal's author had described it as a binding sigil, one that could contain the darkness if drawn correctly. Isabelle's heart raced as she realized what she needed to do. To confront the darkness, she would have to summon it, to bind it within her grasp. The thought sent chills down her spine, but there was a flicker of determination deep within her. She could not run away from this. It was time to stand her ground. She gathered the scattered items on the table, a mix of old candles, bits of string, and remnants of forgotten spells. With meticulous care, she arranged the candles in a circle, placing them at the points of the binding sigil she had seen in the journal. Each candle was a flickering beacon against the encroaching shadows, a promise of light in the growing darkness. As she lit the first candle, the flame flickered to life, casting warm light that pushed back the shadows momentarily. Isabelle felt a surge of power as the room brightened. With each candle she lit, she visualized the warmth expanding, wrapping around her like a protective cocoon. She focused on her intentions, her desire to confront the darkness and bring peace to the restless souls that lingered within. With the circle complete, Isabelle took a deep breath and stepped into the center. The shadows whispered around her, their cold breath brushing against her skin, but she stood firm, resolute. She closed her eyes, letting the flickering candlelight fill her vision, and concentrated on the sigil she had drawn. In her mind, she envisioned the darkness, twisting and turning, a roiling mass of despair. She focused on it, reaching out with her thoughts, willing it to come forth. The air grew thick with tension as she called to the shadows, invoking their presence. The temperature dropped, the candle flames flickering wildly as if in response to an unseen force. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a chorus of voices that echoed in her mind. They spoke of pain and suffering, of loss and betrayal, their anguish resonating within her. Isabelle felt their sorrow wash over her, a wave of emotions that threatened to pull her under. She struggled to maintain her focus, pushing against the tide of despair. The darkness seeped into the room, swirling around her like a tempest, tangible and oppressive. Shadows writhed at the edges of her vision, threatening to engulf her. She could feel their presence, a dark energy pressing in from all sides, demanding her fear and submission. But she stood firm, anchoring herself in the center of the sigil. With a final surge of will, Isabelle called out to the darkness, demanding it to reveal itself. She felt a ripple through the air, as if the very fabric of reality shifted. The shadows coiled tighter around her, and in that moment, she glimpsed it, a shape emerging from the depths, a figure cloaked in darkness, its face hidden in the shadows. Isabelle's heart raced, but she refused to back down. The figure was a manifestation of all the pain and sorrow that had lingered in the house, the embodiment of despair that had been unleashed. She could feel its presence, a mix of sorrow and rage, swirling around her like a storm. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows pressed closer, their whispers intensifying. It was now or never. Isabelle reached into her memories, recalling the stories of those who had been lost to the darkness. She thought of the children, the families torn apart, the secrets buried beneath the weight of despair. She focused on their pain, on the need for resolution, and she poured that energy into the sigil, willing the darkness to acknowledge their suffering. The figure paused, its movement stilled by her determination. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the shadows hovered in place, the air heavy with anticipation. Isabelle felt a connection form between her and the darkness, an understanding that bridged the gap between the two. With a deep breath, she invoked the sigil, channeling the light of the candles into a force that pierced the shadows. The flames surged, illuminating the room with a brilliant glow, pushing back the darkness that threatened to consume her. The figure recoiled, its form twisting and shifting as the light intensified, the whispers turning to cries of anguish. Isabelle felt the power of the sigil grow, the warmth of the light radiating outward, binding the darkness within its circle. The shadows writhed in protest, but she held firm, her heart steady as she focused on the light. She would not let fear dictate her actions any longer. The cries of the shadows transformed into a wail, a sound of sorrow that echoed through the cabin, shaking the very foundations of the house. The figure began to dissolve, the darkness unraveling like threads pulled from a fabric. Isabelle could feel the weight of the pain lifting, the anguish dissipating into the air as the shadows were drawn into the sigil. With a final burst of energy, she released the binding sigil, sending the darkness spiraling away into the ether. The air lightened, and the whispers faded, leaving a profound silence in their wake. Isabelle stood in the center of the circle, heart racing, the candlelight flickering gently around her. She opened her eyes, the world coming back into focus. The darkness had receded, and the cabin felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its walls. The remnants of the past lingered, but the oppressive presence had been banished, at least for now. Exhaustion washed over her, but there was a sense of peace in the air. Isabelle knew that she had confronted the darkness within and had emerged stronger. The battle was not over, but she had taken the first step toward uncovering the truth behind the house and its shadows. As she extinguished the remaining candles, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls, she felt a sense of hope bloom within her. She had faced the darkness and survived, and now she was ready to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within the house. Isabelle took a deep breath, determination burning in her chest. The darkness had been pushed back, but the journey was far from over. There were still mysteries to unravel, still souls to be set free. She would continue her fight against the shadows, and she would not rest until the truth was revealed. Chapter 12. The Unveiling. The dawn broke slowly, casting a pale light through the grimy window of the cabin. Isabelle awoke on the wooden floor, feeling the ache in her bones from the previous night's confrontation with the shadows. She blinked against the light, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep and the weight of exhaustion that hung heavy on her eyelids. As she pushed herself up, the air felt different, charged with energy and a sense of purpose. The darkness that had surrounded her before had lifted, but the remnants of its presence lingered like a whisper in the back of her mind. She needed to move, to act on the knowledge she had gained from the journal and the confrontation. The past was calling, and it was time to uncover the secrets that lay hidden within the walls of the house. Isabelle rose to her feet, the wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the scattered items she had left behind during her frantic preparation. The candles were burned down to stubs, their wax pooling on the table. The journal lay open, pages fluttering slightly in the gentle morning breeze that slipped through the cracked window. She gathered the remnants of the previous night, carefully placing the spent candles and the journal into her bag. There was no time to waste. The sun was rising, and with it came the promise of clarity. She could feel it in her bones. The house was waiting for her, and the answers were just within reach. With a sense of determination, Isabelle stepped outside the cabin, the cool morning air washing over her like a refreshing tide. The forest stood silent around her, the trees bathed in soft light. She took a moment to breathe it in, grounding herself before she made her way back to the house that had become the center of her tumultuous journey. As she walked through the forest, the sounds of the night faded into memory, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the chirping of distant birds. The path was familiar now, the way to the house imprinted in her mind. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if she were shedding the remnants of fear that had clung to her during her time in the cabin. When she finally reached the house, it stood before her like a looming giant, its weathered facade bathed in the soft light of dawn. The front door hung slightly ajar, an invitation to step back into the depths of its secrets. Isabelle hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as she recalled the shadows that had chased her through the night. But this time, she felt a surge of confidence. She was not the same girl who had fled in fear. She was armed with knowledge and resolve. Isabelle pushed the door open fully, the hinges creaking in protest as she stepped inside. The air felt thick with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She moved through the familiar rooms, the memories of her previous encounters flooding her mind. Each corner seemed to whisper its secrets, each shadow hiding a story waiting to be unveiled. She made her way to the hidden room, her heart racing with each step. The door stood closed, but she could sense the energy pulsing behind it, a mixture of anticipation and dread. This was where it had all begun, where the darkness had first revealed itself. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed the door open. The room was dim, the remnants of the candles from her last encounter still flickering in the corners. Isabelle stepped inside, her eyes drawn to the altar at the center. It was unchanged, adorned with the same symbols and offerings that had haunted her dreams. But this time, she felt a sense of clarity. She had come to confront the darkness, to unearth the truth that lay buried within. With the journal in hand, she approached the altar, her heart pounding in anticipation. She laid the journal open on the surface, its pages fluttering slightly in the draft. The symbols seemed to pulse with energy, calling to her as she traced her fingers over them. She needed to decipher their meaning, to understand what they held. As she studied the markings, Isabelle felt a rush of energy coursing through her. The air crackled with electricity, and she closed her eyes, allowing the sensations to wash over her. In that moment, the past and present collided, and she was drawn into a vision, a tapestry of memories woven from the threads of time. Flashes of images swirled in her mind. She saw families gathered around the altar, their faces etched with sorrow. She witnessed rituals performed in desperation, each one trying to appease the darkness that loomed over them. She felt their fear, their anguish, and their yearning for release. The weight of their stories pressed against her heart, a burden she was now determined to bear. Isabelle gasped as the vision intensified, the shadows swirling around her like a tempest. She could hear the echoes of their cries, their pleas for help resonating through the air. She had to do something. She couldn't let their pain go unanswered. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. She had the power to help them, to set them free from the clutches of the darkness. With renewed resolve, she focused on the symbols before her. Each one represented a story, a soul trapped in the web of despair. She needed to draw them out, to release their pain and bring light back to the house. She quickly began to sketch the symbols on the altar with a piece of charcoal she found nearby, her hands moving with purpose and precision. As she inscribed the final symbol, the air around her shimmered with energy, the darkness swirling with newfound intensity. The candles flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced on the walls. Isabelle could feel the presence of the lost souls, their energy coalescing around her like a storm, and she knew she was close to unveiling the truth. In that moment, she whispered a silent prayer, a plea for guidance and strength. She had to confront the darkness, to pull the souls from the shadows and bring them into the light. With a steady breath, she placed her hands on the altar, channeling her energy into the symbols she had drawn. The room trembled as a surge of power flowed through her, the darkness responding to her call. Shadows coiled around her arms, brushing against her skin like a cold breeze, but she remained undeterred. The energy pulsing from the altar grew stronger, drawing the lost souls closer, pulling them from the depths of despair. Isabelle felt the shadows shift, their forms becoming more defined as they began to emerge from the darkness. Faces appeared before her, twisted in sorrow and grief, eyes filled with longing for release. She could see their pain, their stories etched in the lines of their faces. They were trapped, caught in a cycle of despair that had persisted for far too long. With a fierce determination, she reached out to them, her heart swelling with compassion. She focused on their pain, allowing it to wash over her as she summoned the strength to release them. The symbols glowed brightly, illuminating the room with a warm light that pushed back the shadows, revealing the lost souls in their entirety. One by one, they emerged from the darkness, their forms shimmering like ghosts. They looked at her with a mix of gratitude and sorrow, their expressions shifting as they felt the warmth of the light enveloping them. Isabelle's heart ached for them, but she knew this was their moment of release. They had endured too much suffering, and it was time for them to be set free. The shadows writhed and twisted around her, but she held firm, anchoring herself in the center of the altar. The light continued to grow, enveloping the room in a soft glow that pushed back the darkness, illuminating the faces of the souls who had once been trapped. Their expressions began to shift, and she felt a sense of peace wash over her as they finally found solace. The energy surged once more, and with a final flash of light, the souls were released, dissipating into the air like wisps of smoke. Isabelle watched in awe as they floated away, free at last from the pain that had held them captive for so long. The darkness began to recede, the room lightening with each passing moment. As the last of the souls vanished, a profound silence enveloped the space. The shadows that had once loomed large were now nothing more than a faint echo, a whisper of what had been. Isabelle stood in the center of the altar, breathless and overwhelmed, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sadness. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The lost souls were free, their stories unveiled and their pain acknowledged. Isabelle felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that she had never experienced before. She had not only confronted the shadows within the house, but had also helped others find their light. With a deep breath, she stepped away from the altar, the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. The house felt different now, lighter and more alive. The memories of those who had suffered were no longer shackled by despair, but had transformed into a testament of resilience and hope. Isabelle left the hidden room, her heart filled with a sense of peace and accomplishment. The darkness had been unveiled, and she had played a part in the healing of the house. As she stepped back into the light of the living room, she knew her journey was far from over. There were still mysteries to unravel, but she felt ready to face whatever awaited her. With a newfound determination, she set her sights on the path ahead, ready to uncover the remaining secrets that lay hidden within the house. The past had been unveiled, but the future was still unwritten, and Isabelle was prepared to write her own story. Chapter 13. The Lurking Presence. The light of day was slowly fading as Isabelle stepped away from the altar, leaving behind the remnants of her encounter with the lost souls. The atmosphere in the house had shifted. It was lighter, infused with the echoes of liberation, yet a lingering chill still danced through the air, whispering of shadows yet to be faced. She felt a tension in the air, a stirring that hinted at something deeper, something still hidden. She moved cautiously through the now familiar rooms, her senses heightened. The quietness of the house felt almost like a presence itself, as if it were observing her every move. Shadows lengthened in the corners, flickering in the fading light. Each room held the weight of history, of stories trapped in silence, and she felt a compulsion to uncover every last one. The kitchen was dimly lit, with only the last rays of sunlight filtering through the dirty window. Isabelle stepped inside, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She glanced at the old wooden table, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. Memories of family dinners and laughter seemed to linger in the air, but the sadness of the past still clung to the walls, like a fog that refused to lift. Isabelle opened the cupboards, her fingers brushing against the cool wood as she searched for any clues. The space was cluttered with old dishes, some chipped and faded, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the house was holding onto secrets she had yet to uncover. Her gaze wandered to the back door, leading out to the small yard. She remembered her earlier encounter with the shadows outside, how they had danced in the moonlight, taunting her. Curiosity gripped her, and she stepped outside, the chill of the evening air wrapping around her like a shroud. The yard was overgrown, weeds climbing up the sides of the old wooden fence. Isabelle wandered through the tangled mess, her heart racing with anticipation. The shadows cast by the dying light stretched across the ground, creating a patchwork of darkness that seemed alive. She felt a pull towards the far corner, where the trees thickened, their branches intertwined like fingers grasping at the sky. As she approached the tree line, a sense of foreboding washed over her. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows grew deeper, swallowing the light. Isabelle hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the house, but the lure of the unknown was too strong. She stepped into the gloom, her heart pounding in her chest as she pushed through the underbrush. The trees loomed overhead, their trunks thick and gnarled. The sounds of the outside world faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that wrapped around her like a vice. Isabelle pressed on, her instincts guiding her deeper into the forest. She could feel a presence lurking just beyond her line of sight, something watching her, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The path twisted and turned, each step taking her further away from the safety of the house. The shadows danced at the edge of her vision, flickering like whispers in the dark. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on her, the air thick with an unspoken threat. But with each step, she felt more determined to confront whatever lay ahead. After what felt like an eternity, she stumbled upon a clearing bathed in twilight. At its center stood an ancient stone well, its edges worn smooth by time. Vines twisted around its base, creeping up the sides like serpents. Isabelle approached cautiously, drawn to the well as if it held the answers to her unasked questions. The well's surface reflected the last remnants of daylight, shimmering like a portal to another realm. Isabelle leaned closer, peering into the darkness below. The air around the well felt heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She could sense the presence growing stronger, the shadows coiling like smoke at the edge of her vision. As she stood there, the air shifted suddenly. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, rustling the leaves above and sending a shiver down her spine. Isabelle took a step back, her heart racing. The shadows thickened around her, swirling like a tempest, and she could feel them beckoning her closer, urging her to peer deeper into the abyss. With a deep breath, she leaned closer again, focusing on the darkness within the well. A voice echoed in her mind, a whisper that sent chills coursing through her veins. She closed her eyes, trying to silence the noise, but it was too late. The shadows surged forward, enveloping her in a whirlwind of darkness. In that instant, the well transformed into a vortex, pulling her down into its depths. She felt herself falling, tumbling through the void as the shadows wrapped around her like tendrils of smoke. Images flashed before her eyes, disjointed memories and fragmented scenes that rushed by in a blur. She saw glimpses of the families that had once inhabited the house, their faces twisted in anguish, their cries echoing through time. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. Isabelle landed on cold, hard ground, disoriented and gasping for breath. She opened her eyes to find herself in a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with a palpable darkness. The walls were lined with symbols, the same markings she had seen in the hidden room, but here they pulsed with a life of their own. Isabelle pushed herself up, taking in her surroundings. The chamber felt alive, buzzing with energy. She could see shadows flitting along the walls, whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. Fear gripped her, but beneath it was a fierce determination. She had come too far to turn back now. As she rose to her feet, the shadows coalesced around her, swirling like a storm. They seemed to be waiting, watching her every move. Isabelle took a step forward, her heart pounding as she approached the symbols on the wall. She traced her fingers over the markings, feeling their energy resonate through her. Suddenly, the shadows surged forward, a wave of darkness crashing over her. The chamber spun as she was engulfed in the shadows, the coldness wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. In that moment, Isabelle felt a rush of fear, but it was quickly replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose. She realized that she had the power to confront the lurking presence, to unravel the darkness that had haunted her, and the souls trapped within the house. Isabelle closed her eyes, centering herself. The energy around her pulsed, and she reached deep within, drawing on her own strength. She focused on the light that had helped her free the lost souls, channeling it into the symbols etched into the walls. The shadows writhed in response, their forms twisting and contorting as if in pain. With every ounce of her being, Isabelle pressed on, illuminating the chamber with a warm glow. The shadows began to retreat, hissing as the light cut through the darkness. She could feel their anger, their desperation to cling to her, but she refused to let them take her. She had faced the darkness before, and she would do it again. As the light grew stronger, the chamber trembled, the walls vibrating with energy. The shadows screamed, a chorus of anguish that echoed around her, but she held firm, determined to unveil the truth behind their existence. The symbols flared brighter, lighting up the chamber with an ethereal glow. Then, with one final surge of power, the shadows exploded in a burst of darkness, retreating into the corners of the chamber. The air crackled with energy as the remnants of their presence dissipated into the void. Isabelle stood in the center of the chamber, breathing heavily as the oppressive weight of the darkness lifted. She had confronted the lurking presence and emerged victorious. But the battle was far from over. There were still secrets to uncover, still shadows lurking in the corners of her mind. With renewed determination, Isabelle stepped forward, ready to delve deeper into the mysteries that awaited her. The path to the truth was fraught with danger, but she had already faced her fears. The light within her burned bright, guiding her through the darkness as she prepared to unveil the final layers of the house's haunting past. With each step she took, she felt a sense of purpose wash over her, ready to confront whatever awaited her in the shadows. Chapter 14. The Final Confrontation. Isabelle stood at the threshold of the ancient chamber, her heart racing in anticipation of what lay ahead. The air crackled with energy, and the dim light cast eerie shadows along the walls. She had uncovered fragments of the house's history, but the most crucial piece remained hidden. As the remnants of the shadows faded, a strange calm washed over her, yet an undercurrent of tension persisted. Determined to unravel the final mystery, she stepped deeper into the chamber. The pulsating symbols on the walls whispered secrets, beckoning her to understand their meaning. Isabelle ran her fingers along the intricate designs, feeling their warmth, sensing the stories they held. Each symbol resonated with energy, forming a bridge to the past, a connection to the souls that had suffered within these walls. The chamber opened up into a vast hall, its high ceiling disappearing into darkness. Cobwebs hung like drapes from the edges, and dust floated through the air, illuminated by the faint glow of the symbols behind her. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The shadows might have retreated, but she knew they were not gone. They lurked just beyond her sight, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Isabelle continued forward, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The hall seemed endless, stretching out before her like a labyrinthine puzzle. Each step felt like a heartbeat, thumping in time with the pulse of the house. The deeper she ventured, the more alive the surroundings felt, the air thickening with a sense of foreboding. As she reached the far end of the hall, she discovered a door, ancient and weathered. The wood was splintered, but the handle gleamed as if it had been polished recently. Instinctively, she knew this door held the final truth she sought. Isabelle hesitated, her hand hovering above the handle. A shiver ran down her spine, a warning that reverberated through the air. Gathering her resolve, she gripped the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a small room dimly lit by a single flickering candle. The flames danced erratically, casting long shadows that flickered across the walls. In the center of the room lay a small table, covered in dusty artifacts and remnants of rituals long forgotten. Isabelle stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The walls of the room were adorned with more symbols, their meanings starting to click in her mind. She scanned the artifacts on the table, each one more sinister than the last. There were dried herbs, crumbling papers filled with strange incantations, and a small dagger with an ornate hilt, its blade stained with age. Isabelle's gaze landed on a tattered journal resting at the edge of the table. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The pages were filled with notes scrawled in a frantic hand, detailing the history of the house and the darkness that had consumed it. Each entry spoke of rituals gone wrong, of souls trapped between worlds, and of a malevolent force that thrived on fear. A chill crept up her spine as she read about the entity that haunted the house. It was not just a shadow. It was a being of ancient power, feeding on the despair of those who entered. The more she read, the clearer it became. This entity had been waiting for someone like her to uncover the truth, to set it free from its torment. The shadows around her began to thicken again, swirling at the edges of the room as if responding to the revelation. Isabelle could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, a weight pressing down on her chest. It was as if the darkness had a will of its own, determined to maintain its grip on her. With newfound clarity, she realized she could not confront this force with fear. Instead, she had to harness the light she had discovered within herself. The warmth of the light pulsed in her chest, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. Isabelle closed her eyes, focusing on that light, allowing it to grow, expanding outward until it enveloped her completely. The shadows recoiled, hissing in anger as the light pushed back against them. Isabelle felt the surge of power within her, the culmination of all her experiences and the souls she had helped release. She reached deep, channeling that energy into the air around her, illuminating the room and dispelling the oppressive gloom. The candle flickered violently, and the shadows began to twist and turn, their forms shifting in a chaotic dance. Isabelle stood firm, feeling the entity's rage boiling beneath the surface. She would not be a victim. She would be the force of change. She envisioned the light reaching out, penetrating the darkness, seeking the heart of the malevolence that had thrived in the shadows for so long. With every ounce of determination, she extended her hands, letting the light pour forth. It surged into the shadows, weaving through the darkness and illuminating the room. The shadows writhed in protest, but the light was relentless, pushing back against the force that had held sway for far too long. Suddenly, a howl erupted, echoing through the chamber. The sound resonated deep within her, a blend of anguish and fury that sent chills down her spine. Isabelle opened her eyes, her resolve hardening. She would not back down. This was her moment to confront the darkness. As the shadows shrieked, she focused on the dagger on the table, a vessel of the entity's power. It pulsed with energy, calling to her. She grabbed it, feeling the weight of the past and the lives it had claimed. With a deep breath, she raised the dagger high, channeling her light through it, transforming it into a beacon of hope. The shadows lunged at her, a swirling mass of anger and despair. But with a swift motion, she thrust the dagger forward, letting the light burst forth. The blade gleamed brightly, cutting through the darkness as if it were made of pure energy. The shadows screamed in fury, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke. Isabelle felt the power of the entity waning, the oppressive weight of the darkness lifting. With each scream that faded, the air grew lighter, the shadows retreating until only the light remained. The room began to shimmer, the symbols glowing brightly as the house responded to her strength. Finally, with one last surge of energy, she plunged the dagger into the floor, the impact resonating through the chamber. A wave of light exploded from the point of contact, enveloping the room in a blinding glow. The shadows dissipated, consumed by the radiance, leaving behind a profound silence. Isabelle collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily as the energy around her settled. The journal lay open beside her, the symbols now glowing faintly, a testament to the victory she had achieved. She could feel the weight of the darkness lifting, the air turning crisp and clean. In that moment, Isabelle understood the significance of her journey. She had confronted the shadows, not just within the house, but within herself. The light had triumphed over the darkness, and she had broken the cycle of despair. As the room transformed around her, she felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. As she rose to her feet, Isabelle looked around the room, now illuminated by the warm glow of the symbols. She knew the battle was over, but her journey was just beginning. She had the power to heal, to bring light to others lost in the darkness. With the dagger still embedded in the floor, she stepped back into the hall, the remnants of the past no longer haunting her. The house felt alive, transformed by her victory. The air was filled with a new energy, a promise of hope that would echo through its walls. Isabelle walked forward, ready to embrace the future. The shadows had been vanquished, and in their place stood a legacy of light. She could feel the spirits of those she had helped lingering, grateful for the freedom she had bestowed upon them. Together, they would weave a new story, one of resilience and strength, guiding those who dared to enter this house. With a final glance back at the chamber, Isabelle stepped into the unknown, her heart filled with light. The darkness was a thing of the past, and the path ahead shimmered with possibility. The journey had changed her, and she was ready to face whatever awaited her beyond the horizon, knowing she carried the light within. Chapter 15. The Dawn of a New Beginning. Isabelle stood at the edge of the forest, the first rays of dawn filtering through the trees. The horizon was painted in hues of gold and pink, signaling the arrival of a new day. The air was crisp and fresh, the lingering darkness of the previous night slowly retreating. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin, a gentle reminder that light had triumphed over the shadows. As she gazed into the distance, memories of her journey flooded her mind. The ancient house, once a prison of despair, now felt like a sanctuary of hope. The spirits she had helped release lingered in her thoughts, their gratitude echoing in her heart. Each encounter had taught her something profound, and each shadow had brought her closer to understanding her own strength. The forest around her was alive with the sounds of morning. Birds sang cheerfully, their melodies weaving through the trees, while the rustle of leaves whispered secrets of the night that had passed. Isabelle smiled softly, embracing the serenity of the moment. She felt a connection to the world, a sense of belonging that had eluded her for so long. Turning away from the forest, she made her way back to the house. It stood tall against the morning sky, its facade gleaming with a new light. The windows, once dark and foreboding, now sparkled as the sun illuminated them. Each step she took felt purposeful, a reaffirmation of her commitment to nurture the change she had fought so hard to achieve. As she entered the house, the familiar sense of aged wood and fresh air enveloped her. The interior was transformed. The shadows that had once clung to the corners seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a warmth that welcomed her. Isabelle felt a surge of energy, an echo of the battle she had fought, lingering in the air. She wandered through the rooms, taking in the vibrant energy that pulsed within the walls. The symbols she had once seen as ominous now appeared as marks of resilience, each one a testament to the battles fought and won. They glowed softly, reminders of the stories they held, each one a bridge between the past and the present. In the living room, she paused before the fireplace, where the ashes from the last remnants of darkness had been swept away. Isabelle knelt down, her fingers grazing the smooth stones that formed the hearth. It was here that she had confronted her fears, the place where she had transformed the darkness into light. She felt a profound sense of closure wash over her, a final farewell to the shadows that had haunted her for so long. Moving through the house, she began to envision how she could honor the spirits that had once been trapped within its walls. The idea blossomed within her, a plan to create a space that would welcome others seeking solace and healing. She imagined turning the house into a sanctuary, a refuge for those who had experienced their own darkness. Isabelle gathered her thoughts, sketching out ideas in her mind. She envisioned bright rooms filled with plants, soft colors, and inviting furnishings. Each space would be designed to foster healing, to offer warmth and comfort. The garden outside would bloom with vibrant flowers, a testament to the life that had returned. As she moved to the kitchen, Isabelle felt a pang of nostalgia. This had been the heart of the house, where meals had been shared and laughter had once echoed. Now, it was time to fill it with joy once more. She could almost hear the clatter of dishes and the warmth of conversations that would soon fill the air. Stepping outside, she took in the expanse of the garden. Weeds had overrun the once beautiful landscape, but Isabelle saw potential in the untamed growth. With a vision in her mind, she rolled up her sleeves and began to clear the debris, her hands working tirelessly in the soil. Each weed she uprooted was a release, a symbol of the darkness being swept away. Hours passed as she toiled under the sun, sweat glistening on her brow. With every handful of dirt, she felt lighter, more liberated. She envisioned the garden blooming, vibrant flowers that would attract butterflies and birds. It would become a sanctuary for those seeking refuge, just as the house would. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground, Isabelle stepped back to admire her work. The garden was taking shape, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. She felt an overwhelming sense of purpose and fulfillment. The shadows had not just been defeated. They had paved the way for something beautiful to emerge. Night fell softly around her, but this time, it felt comforting rather than oppressive. The moon rose high in the sky, bathing the garden in silvery light. Isabelle sat on the steps of the porch, taking in the tranquility of the moment. The world around her was alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, and the rustle of leaves whispered secrets of the night. The house stood silently behind her, a sentinel of her journey. It had witnessed her fears and triumphs, but now it would stand as a beacon of hope for others. She felt a sense of kinship with it, understanding that they had both emerged stronger from the ordeal. As she sat in the stillness, Isabelle closed her eyes, allowing the night to envelop her. She envisioned all the souls who would walk through the doors of the house, those searching for solace, healing, and hope. Each one would be welcomed with open arms, offered the space to confront their own darkness. The house was no longer just a structure. It was a living entity, a testament to resilience and renewal. Together, they would embark on a journey of healing, guiding lost souls toward the light. With a heart full of gratitude, Isabelle rose from the steps, her spirit lifted by the promise of the future. She turned to face the house one last time, her heart swelling with anticipation. This was the dawn of a new beginning, not just for her, but for all who would come to find refuge within its walls. With determination fueling her steps, she walked inside, ready to begin the next chapter of her life. The darkness had been vanquished, and in its place stood a legacy of light and hope. Together, they would weave a new story, one that celebrated life, resilience, and the power of transformation.